Hello everyone and welcome to Real History. I'm your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and we have something incredibly special lined up for you in this episode and many upcoming episodes. In these, we will be revisiting the classic HBO series, The Pacific, and for these, for expert guest analysis, we are joined by an incredibly special guest. Henry, would you please introduce yourself to all of our viewers and explain your very special relationship that you have to this film?
Thanks, Jared. I'm Henry Sledge. I am Eugene Sledge's youngest son.
And he, of course, is one of the key protagonists in this series, and I think in so many ways is the heart and soul of the series as well. And all throughout, he is going to be sharing some insider perspectives, not only on family history, the exploits of his dad, but also some behind-the-scenes stories about what it took to make this film and how your family was involved.
Yeah, it really was a process into itself. And so there were a lot of interesting conversations through the years when it all started till this thing came to fruition in 2010. So. And
one thing that really sticks out to me from our previous conversations, you said at first you were not a huge fan of this series, but it's come to really grow on you in the years since.
Correct. When it first came out, well, I was intimately familiar, as I'm sure all of our viewers of this program are going to be, of Band of Brothers. Knew every line in it. Saving Private Ryan, knew every line in it. Was just a huge fan of the work that Hanks and Spielberg brought to the whole World War II viewing experience. It was a dream come true to have my father's book be picked up by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg and to be source material for the Pacific miniseries. And so I guess I was just so close to the story that as through the creative process, through the artistic process, I just had certain expectations. I was just too close to it. I wanted things to be just so. And then when I watched the first cut, then we'll get to those things and we'll unpack all that. But yeah, it was, I had to go through a mental process. Bruce McKenna, who of course is one of the main writers, co-executive producer, a key figure in this whole process. Bruce and I are dear friends. We laugh about it. We've been on podcasts together. We laugh about it now. But at the time when it came out, I wasn't sure. I watched it and that was it. And I didn't touch it again for 11 years. And then in the fall or late summer of 2021, and there was a story to that, but I came back around. I was reeled back into the World War II community, and I said, you know what? I need to give this thing another chance because I had some conversations with my friends Matt Leach and Leighton Hughes from We Happy Few 506. Matt Leach, of course, being one of the actors from Band of Brothers. And talking to them, I realized this thing is still out there. It still has legs. It's still generating a following. And maybe I need to take another look at this. And so I just took a couple of days off work and sat down. I told my wife, I said, I'm going to watch The Pacific. I'm going to start up from part one like I've never seen it. And I'm going to watch the whole thing. And I did. And as soon as I was finished, I sat down and I watched it all again. And I realized, and I haven't stopped watching it since. Bruce McKenna and I were on a podcast together not long after that. And I told him, I said, Bruce, I just want to tell you, I love what you did. And I said that to Kirk Sadusky, another dear friend of ours, dear friend of my family, Kirk Sadusky. And I said that to him. I said, I see the brilliance of the Pacific. I didn't see it at first, but I see it now. And I remember right before it came out, Bruce told me, he said, Henry, I know how much you love Band of Brothers. He said, I'm telling you, this is going to be different. It's a different, more visceral, under the rim of the helmet, beneath the rim of the helmet, view of warfare and the effect that it has psychologically on its participants. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I understand, let's get on with it. Well, that really sunk in, and I came to understand what he truly meant by that when I re-engaged with the Pacific in these last few years.
I think that's a great bit of prologue, and we have many more wonderful stories like that to come. We have a lot to unpack in some forthcoming episodes, so let's go ahead and get started with episode 1 of The Pacific. It's in so many ways a perfect beginning. We're in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. We're in the build-up to Christmas. We're introduced to the character of Leckie, who was born in Philadelphia, raised in New Jersey. This was a man who really wanted to be a Marine.
Yeah.
In fact, as part of his medical requirements, he actually had to be circumcised to become a Marine. Right? And so, as an adult, that is the the test. That was his first test, is I want to be a Marine. So it really spoke.
He really wanted to be a Marine.
Yes.
Fifth in line.
Well, if I don't see you before you go, take care of yourself.
You know, Helmet for My Pillow is a great book. It was one of the first World War II books I read, you know, being like 11, 12 years old. But when my dad would sit at his desk writing, and I would have been about 12 years old, I recall, and before With the Old Breed came out, he would have been working on it. I remember reading his copy that he had gotten in 1957 of Helmet for My Pillow that he had made notes in.
You don't tell me I missed this thing.
Justice coming.
Josh Baton, very good friend of mine, great guy.
The uniform that you wear, and the globe and anchor emblem that you have earned, will make the difference between the freedom of the world and its enslavement.
As we take a look at the map here, it's interesting to note that Iceland is shown in red, that there's perhaps Nazi invasion pushing toward it. And there's a little bit of subtext in regard to the Marine Corps, because the Marines actually sent the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade to Iceland in 1941. It was a neutral country. Great Britain had been overseeing it beforehand. Iceland was part of Denmark. So for a spell, the Marines were in the North Atlantic before they went to the Pacific.
Here is what the Japs are not expecting. The United States Marine Corps.
Yeah, I thought William Sadler did a really good job as Chesty Puller.
You, non-commissioned officers, you are the sinew and the muscle of the Corps.
These non-commissioned officers would have been part of the peacetime military. A lot of them probably enlisted as a means of escaping the economic woes of the Great Depression. And certainly John Basilone fits within that category. A lot of people don't realize, though, that he had served in the Army prior to going into the Marines. He had served in the Philippines. He gained the nickname of Manila John. And so I think it pains some Marines today that he actually never went to boot camp. He went through traditional basic training in the 1930s, which gives a little bit of service competition, I think.
Right.
You know, Army guys can say, "Oh, well, you know who trained him." You know, so, fun stuff like that.
Right. And your comment's really perceptive about the economics of the times, because you think about how many of these guys enlisting in the Marine Corps and getting a cot, 3 square meals a day, and clothes on your back. For some of those guys, that was a step up. You know, when you look at the backgrounds that some of them came from, certainly not the case with my dad, but be it the Marines, the Army, Navy, I mean, a lot of these young men during the Depression era, that was a step up. I liked these scenes of the Basilone house. And I'll tell you why, because in part 10, you know, when we come full circle, Lena Basilone comes back to give the Medal of Honor, John's Medal of Honor, to his parents. I know it hit me and we'll talk about it in part 10, but they're sitting in the living room, and of course they're grieving for John Basilone, but it shows, you can see back into that dining room, and I'm thinking, you know, we've literally seen, this is full circle.
It's a 180, very much so.
You know.
I think these Christmas time scenes are very important. In many ways, they're foundational because people are somewhat happy. There is a degree of seasonal cheer. They're optimistic to an extent. They say that hopefully we will be back at this table a year from now. By next Christmas. Every war's supposed to be over by Christmas, as the old saying goes. And I think in so many ways they have no idea what's ahead of them.
When you think militarily, logistically, economically, I mean, the scope, the breadth of what had to be done, it boggles the mind what had to be accomplished.
I'm sorry, Mom. Yeah, I know.
That's a touching scene because you see the father-son moment. My mom and Vera Leckie actually formed a really good relationship. They actually, HBO formed some joint interviews with them. I don't know that footage was ever used, but Mrs. Leckie I remember my mom telling me, you know, Vera said that like this scene right here, they didn't even have a car.
Interesting.
You know, so a little bit of artistic license, certainly understandable.
So you need that.
Oh, I thought I might fight
In both
by
the
day
first
right by
and the
night,
last
Dad.
episode, you get this sort of generational tale. It is a story of fathers and sons and how they interact with each other, how they are support systems, or perhaps in Leckie's case, how his father is emotionally absent for him, which stands in contrast to how your grandfather helped out your dad.
Yeah, my grandfather and my father and my uncle had he was not emotionally distant, and having been a physician and having treated wounded from World War I, they called them shell shock victims back then. They were just victims of PTSD, as we would know now. I think my grandfather was very emotionally available and an incredibly intelligent man.
Son.
We had a lot of conversations with Bruce McKenna about how they were going to introduce the Sledge character. Here we see in a back room at my grandparents' house where my grandfather's examining my dad to see if his heart murmur was still there. What actually happened was my father went to my grandfather's office in downtown Mobile. But I love the way they did this. I thought it was very well portrayed.
What sort of interactions or conversations did you have with the actor Joseph Mazzello before he started playing your father?
When when the series was greenlit, meaning officially approved, HBO said, we're going to write the checks for this, it's going to happen. That happened in 2008. Of course, initial conversations between us and Kirk Sadusky and Bruce McKenna started in 2004, but it was 2008 before the series was actually greenlit. And Bruce explained to me that when it's greenlit, that's it. It is full bore. It's going to happen. But Joe called us. He called my brother. He called my mother. He called me. He and I had a great conversation. This part right here, I didn't, and I told Bruce this, my dad did not cry when my grandfather, well, of course, when my grandfather examined him, he was okay. But I understand they want to show just that visceral sense of Sledge wanting to serve, and he's bitterly disappointed. Great shot. I mean, these interior shots of my grandparents' house, even though it is not the actual house that my grandfather, and there's Deacon, the family dog. I mean, that just looks so much like my grandmother's house. My grandfather talking to my Uncle Edward. My uncle was a graduate of the Citadel and ended up being an armored tank platoon commander in 741st Tank Battalion. I remember Bruce telling my mom because my mother told me, well, they're going to have your dad ride his bike over to Sid's house to talk about enlisting right before Sid leaves.
Oh, you were saying about some of the exchanges that you were having with Joe the actor.
Yeah, Joe called. We had a really long conversation. He made an excellent impression on me and my family. You know, he struck us as just being a serious-minded young man, you know, the kind of guy who could take on that part and learn the nuances of it and how to just engage with it. And then, of course, we met him at the premiere. There was a premiere that we went to in Hollywood and a premiere in New Orleans and one in Mobile. And we interacted with him at all of those, and just a really nice guy. We met his parents and his girlfriend at the time. I remember my friend Richard Frank talking about how they were going to do the pull-in shots of the map to try to, you know, because the thing was, I mean, Bruce McKenna told us from the very beginning that Tom and Stephen wanted to cover the entire panoply of the Pacific War. So they couldn't just have one unit like Easy Company going into Europe. They had to cover different people to cover the entire arc of the Pacific War. That artistically, creatively, I mean, that was a huge challenge.
Yeah. Because we go from a very big jump there in regard to both time and space, going from Mobile in December 1941 here to Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942. And some people said that perhaps one of the weaknesses of this film is that you didn't get that sort of boot camp experience, that you didn't get a sense of camaraderie building in the characters that you did at Camp Toccoa in A Band of Brothers. But considering the expanse, I mean, this covers more than double the timeline of Band of Brothers. You just can't fit it all in.
No, Jared, that's a great point. You can't. And also, I would add, Bruce and I had this conversation. I remember him telling me, there will be no Marine Corps boot camp scenes in my miniseries. He said, Marine Corps boot camp has been done to death, in my opinion, through the years. And he said, we're not going to do that here.
That's fair.
But that meshes very well with what you just said, because again, we're not doing the Easy Company, you know, 3 miles up, 3 miles down. They're all bonding and, you know, building that camaraderie. We geographically we just didn't have the time to do that. I mean, originally we were told the Pacific was going to be 13 parts with 5 main characters.
Wow. Okay.
As the process went on and on and on, and of course it took longer to get the Pacific out than they wanted it to. Things began to be streamlined, be it for budgetary constraints or what have you, and we ended up obviously with 10 parts and 3 main characters. I know at one time they were talking about doing some sort of USO troop to kind of go around, and this USO troop was going to go around and visit different bases in the Pacific, and I guess they were going to use that as a vehicle to tie all the main characters together.
Wow.
That was talked about for a while. Obviously, that didn't happen, and honestly, I'm kind of glad that it didn't.
Let's go get him!
I really liked the scenes of the shelling of Guadalcanal and then climbing down the nets. I remember Sid Phillips and I had some conversations. I thought that was very well done right there, and I'm sure, you know, some graphic arts expert could see the lines behind the curtain, so to speak, but I felt like it was very well portrayed. But Sid Phillips and I had some really good conversations about you know, D-Day morning at Guadalcanal. I remember him telling me he could look out behind the troop ship that they were on and see there was a line of cruisers, U.S. Navy cruisers, and the air was kind of foggy, of course, from the smoke and the haze of the naval gunfire. But when those cruisers would fire their guns, you could see the entire vessel gently rock on its keel.
Wow. I really enjoy how this scene of the landing craft approaching the beaches, it somewhat psychologically manipulates you because it bears so much aesthetic resemblance to the opening of Saving Private Ryan.
Right.
You're kind of sitting on the edge of your seat the first time you're watching and think, oh no, these guys are going to get mowed down just like on Omaha Beach.
Right.
But of course then, that doesn't happen. I think that's a very purposeful psych on the part of the filmmakers because the beaches were uncontested.
Uncontested. And I will say this, I'm glad you brought that up because I said this to Bruce McKenna and Kirk Sadusky. Saving Private Ryan, for all the brilliance of that opening scene, I don't know if anybody else has noticed this. What I noticed, like, of course, the focus is on the guys coming out of the landing craft. There are two things that you don't see that are glaringly absent. You don't see airplanes flying overhead, and you don't see naval ships in the background bombarding the beach, which was absolutely there. Here you see it. They did a beautiful job here in this scene and the one at Peleliu. You see aircraft flying over. I love that. You've got your Navy ships in the background providing bombardment. You get a sense of a flotilla, of a major task force. And Saving Private Ryan didn't have that.
I think that's a fair criticism. Check out our episode on Saving Private Ryan while you're here on Real History.
And I love Saving Private Ryan. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. Yeah. But when they pull back, you see the LCVP just kind of rocking in the surf, and it's like, wouldn't there have been follow-on waves? Wouldn't there have been aircraft?
Very much so.
They poisoned 1 billion coconuts?
Bruce and Hugh told me during the creative process that a celebratory moment for them was when they realized that Sid Phillips and Robert Leckie, that Sid Phillips was a link between Eugene Sledge and Robert Leckie, because Sid Phillips, of course, was an H-21, just like Leckie. Sledge, of course, was K-35, and possibly could have met Leckie on Pavuvu, but who knows? I mean, it's possible. They certainly wouldn't have known each other at the time. But Sid Phillips was a bridge between the two of them.
Yeah.
And that was a celebratory moment for the creative team.
Especially considering that those two men wrote really profound books after. I mean, what are the chances that Sid Phillips would be the bridge for something like that? It's
exactly. In 2007, when Ken Burns, well, it would have been pre-2007 because my brother told me this. Ken Burns came to Mobile in the lead up to the war, and he was talking to my brother, and my brother said, "Look, I'll tell you who you need to talk to. He's right down the road in Theodore, just south of Mobile, and that's Sid Phillips. He was my dad's best friend." And of course, Ken Burns got a 2-for-1 out of that because not only did he develop a delightful relationship with Sid Phillips, but also with Catherine Phillips, who was Sid's sister, and Catherine knew my dad very well.
I think it's a brilliant documentary how they made that.
It was. And you see the Thompson with the drum, the Gangster magazine.
Yes, and that was dropped fairly quickly because rounds would jam in the cylinder in this very humid and dirty environment. So when you see the drum cylinder, it's early in the Pacific War. You don't see that much later on.
As a kid, I was, and I've said this in a lot of interviews and podcasts, I developed a passion for this history very early on, and talking to my father in conversations we had. I was fascinated by the Thompson submachine gun, the Tommy gun, and to know that my dad carried one, not at first, obviously he carried a carbine as a mortarman, but he and Snafu shared a Tommy gun later, and I loved that firearm. I just developed a passion for it. But I remember as a kid, and I went to the dime store and bought a little plastic one with the little clacker in it. You pull the trigger and it had that little plastic clacker in it. But I remember my dad explaining to me, well, yeah, the early ones, in all the gangster movies, you see the drum magazine. Well, we didn't have those in the Pacific because they did at Guadalcanal, but the humidity just jammed them up.
There's a scene that's, I think, in many ways a grim foreshadowing of the brutality that these men will encounter later on, and that is the sight of some of their fellow comrades having been decapitated. And it's reminiscent of a scene that's actually in The Thin Red Line, which is a movie that I'm fond of about Guadalcanal.
Very, very much.
And it is an early indicator that the Japanese aren't really interested in taking prisoners, and we see men being beheaded, having been castrated, and even though they haven't seen the enemy yet, the men who remain, they know the capacity of their enemy at this early moment.
It takes it to a different level. This scenes of hordes of groups of prisoners that we saw in Band of Brothers, we're not going to see that in the Pacific. That did not happen.
A sad reality of war that a lot of people don't like to talk about, or were often hidden from official reports or letters to next of kin, and that is the frequency of friendly fire, especially out in these darker jungle environments where it's hard to distinguish friend from foe.
One of the little nuggets from the unpublished material of my dad's manuscript, which of course I have developed into a manuscript of my own, which will be a book of my own, hopefully one day. My father talked about when they were training on Pavuvu, and it's just a line. They're just marching into the jungle. It's at the end of the day. They're starting to crack jokes with each other, but they're all pretty tired. They just want to get back and take a shower and get back to their tents. But they see a Jeep ambulance come by, and he said they were aware of everybody stopping and turning and looking behind them and kind of moving off the side of the trail, and a Jeep ambulance was making its way past them. And he said it became an all too familiar scene of a cot, a stretcher on the hood of that ambulance, covered with a blanket and muddy boondockers protruding from underneath it. And he said it went by and everybody just got really quiet because we realized that that's another 18, 19-year-old kid who, and a couple of guys were like, what do you think happened to him? And they never found out, but that kind of brought, in that moment, that brought a scintilla of the reality of what they were involved in. Because it could almost feel like just some massive Boy Scout camp. But then you see something like that and you realize this is deadly business.
Lord.
Now, I guess that would have been Savo Island that we're seeing, the Battle of Savo Island?
I believe so. And I do like these nods to the Navy that we have throughout the series. There are a number of naval battles that occur off Guadalcanal, the largest of them taking place that November, which was quite disastrous for the U.S. Navy. Over the course of 3 days, they lose 9 vessels, and even more importantly for these Marines is that they lose the bulk of their supplies on ships that are sunk and those that leave afterward. And so these men find themselves in dire straits as a result.
Here in the moment, I should know in more detail level the difference between Battle of Savo Island and the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, but we see a portrayal there of a disastrous night for the U.S. Navy, because they lost their supplies.
The Elliots with Turner?
Zero crashed into her amidships. They couldn't control the fire, so they scuttled her.
Bon voyage.
Yeah, well, she went down with half the battalion's ammo, most about grubbing medical supplies, and a our asswipe.
This book here is called The Old Breed. This is the 1st Marine Division unit history. All 6 Marine divisions had a unit history written by a participant not long after the war. This one was written by a guy named George McMillan. This was my dad's copy. He got it not long after the end of the war. In the opening, we see where my father signed it. Eugene B. Sledge. He wrote his unit information and then where he was. Now, what's special about this book is at some point, my dad wrote lots of notes in here.
Oh, wow.
Okay. When he was on Pavuvu, and I'll just show you some examples of that.
Wow.
Notes that he wrote about things that he saw. I used some of these notes in my own research for my manuscript. However,
beautiful handwriting.
What he did was he sent this, after he had read it, he sent this to Sid Phillips. Sid Phillips did the same thing and wrote notes in his handwriting.
Oh, wow.
Here's where my father wrote so true
What a
about
treasure.
something. But, you know, this is Sid Phillips' handwriting. So there's this kind of thing throughout. And they exchanged books and each did that for the other.
Wow.
And then this, and I talk about this in my manuscript, George Macmillan wrote this letter to my dad in June 21st, 1982, not long after With the Old Breed came out. And it's a really, I could read it or not. I talk about it in my book, but it's pretty cool what he says about it.
Phenomenal stuff.
It made me think, because Sid had written a comment about losing their supplies on the Elliott.
Wow.
Oh yeah, here it is. 2nd Battalion troops cheered the news that the rusty box was sunk with little loss, that's the Elliott, with little loss of life, and we'd never have to ride that thing again. Could actually hear the cheers as news went through the battalion in the jungle. However, then they found out a lot of their supplies went down also. Anyway.
So they were actually initially happy that their rusty bucket, they wouldn't
initially
have to ride in
happy
it again.
because they were not fond of that tub, but it sunk in what a serious loss happened to the Navy that night. I could go on and on with that.
Wow.
I mean, but I just wanted to.
Let's dig in, Marines.
Here. Hey, Phillips. Want some? It's Jap wine left behind.
It's a great aspect to include here how the Marines in some cases grew reliant on scavenged Japanese supplies. We see them drinking sake here, but they were also eating Japanese rice, a lot of rice.
Which they found near the airfield.
Because they had lost so many of their rations.
It was a shoestring, I mean, it was on a knife edge at Guadalcanal. That's so powerful right there, looking out over that ocean. I guess that would have been Iron Bottom Sound, and seeing nothing there, and realizing that the Navy had pulled out to protect the carriers.
Stay low, stay low. They're just trying to spot our positions. Hold your fire. Hold your fire. They're just trying to spot our positions. Hold your fire. Keep your head down.
They quickly learned to develop fire discipline, at night especially.
Set in along here. Watch the opposite bank.
Here we are introduced to Alligator Creek, which becomes one of the key fixtures in the American defenses. The title's a little bit of a misnomer because they were actually crocodiles and not alligators roaming through it. But this becomes a hinge of the defenses, and the Japanese essentially use the beach leading up to this, and then the creek itself, they pivot, they turn left at the beach, at the creek here, trying to outflank the Americans. And it was perhaps inevitable that there was going to be a clash here just due to the geographic features.
That would be one of my #1 places to visit on Guadalcanal, would be that sand spit. I remember at the premiere sitting in the theater watching this and just how exciting it was, you know, to, of course, and then this scene obviously didn't have the Sledge character because at this point my dad was still, you know, back home and not even in yet. I mean, this was just a climax moment here, you know, because this is where we really start seeing some Pacific combat. It's interesting when you see this leader who they just had a shot of him looking to the right and yelling. You know, he was the one who was talking the bravado when they were, you know, when you see the Japs, kill them all.
Yes.
That was a great scene, but what happens to him here and the way he cracks up and completely folds, it reminds me a lot of things my dad said. The guys who talk the toughest frequently were the first ones to crack up. And they really respected the leaders who were just more quiet and just more serious-minded.
A very Dick Winters, Herbert Sobel dynamic, perhaps.
Yeah.
Skipper! Skipper, you okay? God damn it! He's lost it! Come on!
I think what that scene excels at, as the skipper is cracked, he's cowering in his foxhole. It shows how volatile the chain of command can be in situations like this. And it leads then to the situation, well, who's in charge now? What are they going to do? How are they going to react? As is the case with so many of the actions depicted in this series, it is a story of action and reaction.
Right. Things were so fluid, like you said, volatile. They were fluid, constantly changing. I thought they did a great job with this scene. I mean, it just, everything about it, you know, the smoke, the noise, just the mass confusion. I mean, I remember my father telling me as a kid, you know, that so much of the heavy fighting was at night. Mm-hmm. And I can't imagine trying to keep things straight.
Right.
Stick a pin in him, Doc.
The carnage shown along here at Alligator Creek, it's taken almost verbatim from some period photographs.
Right.
And then that segues into the one Japanese wounded man who pulls a grenade on his would-be rescuers, people who were perhaps going to offer him medical treatment. And there too is another harsh reality that dawns upon these men, that once again, they aren't interested in surrendering. We see a sense of the Bushido code being evinced here, death before dishonor, give all for the emperor. It's a very hard line that is realized.
And it's a stark realization for the Allies that the Japanese are going to be a different kind of enemy.
Yo, monkeys!
Of course, we see the bolt action 03 Springfields. They don't have the M1 Garands yet, or M1 Garand as some people pronounce it.
Our viewers have strong opinions on how to pronounce the M1 Garand.
I'm sure that, no, it's not pronounced Garand, it's pronounced Garand. Well, I've heard a lot of people who know what they're talking about pronounce it either way, so I'm not going to judge.
Yeah. This Japanese soldier in the creek, he is actually shouting out, "I'm tired, shoot me."
Is that what he's saying?
That is what he's saying here. He has had enough. He is submitted to his fate. Although I don't think he'd be able to hit that man that far out with a 1911, but
I was about to say that was a pretty good distance shot with a 45.
They got Rivers, Morley, Abbott, Martin, McDougal. Stanley's blinded.
I think the first time I saw a portrayal of men breaking cigarettes and putting them up their noses against the smell of dead bodies was The Thin Red Line.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of great little details and nuances in that film that are replicated in this one.
Shit. These must be the bastards who took Guam.
This past year, I had the chance to visit some Guam battlefields, and I gained a whole new respect for that theater of operation, and I learned about the plight of the civilians, the Chamorro people who just suffered incredible hardship at the hand of the Japanese, and of course the many U.S. prisoners taken on Guam as well. At the outset of this episode, in that map scene, we get a sense of just how broad the Pearl Harbor attack, quote unquote, is. It's not merely a matter of attack on Pearl Harbor. This is a full-fledged offensive all throughout the Pacific to try to dismantle Western colonial footholds, if you will.
Right. I flew through Guam when I went to Peleliu in 1999, and I really wished I'd had more time to explore Guam itself.
Dear Vera, it seems a lifetime since we met outside St. Mary's.
At this point of his life, Leckie was not yet acquainted with Vera, so he was not writing letters to her, but she works as a very good cinematic device to help convey the inner author that develops in Leckie over time.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I remember Vera, because got to know Vera, lovely lady. Like I said, she and my mom developed a friendship, and I remember she and my mother talking about some of the artistic license. But yeah, it is correct. I mean, that was artistic license having him write to her. But like you say, it works well for what they're trying to do here.
Hey, Johnny Rabb, it's your turn.
Oh, this one here is from a buddy of mine back in Mobile. Dear Sid.
I remember sitting there watching this, and knowing that buddy back home is referring to my dad.
Mm-hmm. Did they, in fact, have a written correspondence during the war before your dad joined up?
They did.
Your humble and obedient servant, Eugene Sledge.
My father, in later years, when he would write notes to me like, hey, be sure you take the garbage out, or be sure you do this, remember your mother asked you to do this, or when he wrote me letters when I was at college, when I was at Auburn, he would always sign them, your humble and obedient servant, Dad. I don't know where he got
even the chore list.
Actually, Jared, what he would do, he signed it YHAOS.
Oh, okay.
He'd leave notes for me like, hey, be sure you do the YHAOS, Dad.
Such a Southern gentleman.
And I knew that YHAOS was your humble and obedient servant, who, if I didn't do what he said do, I would catch hell from, but figuratively speaking, of course. But
Hey, when's your birthday, Sid?
Just a couple weeks ago.
How old are you?
18.
Happy birthday.
That's rich.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Phyllis. Happy birthday to you.
So that first episode takes us into the beginning, into the abyss of Guadalcanal. Where do you think this episode excels?
I like the combat portrayal. I like the introduction of the Sledge character, the portrayal of my grandparents' home, even though it was not the actual home, because my grandmother sold that house, and I was probably 11 years old, so it would have been 1976. But the interior shots of that house really hit a chord with me. I mean, because it reminds me of the way when we would go visit my grandmother when I was a kid. It just captured the way the house looked. Both my grandparents, I thought Linda Cropper did a great job of capturing the essence of Mary Frank Sledge, which we don't see a lot of her here, but we see more of her later. The gentleman who plays my grandfather, I thought he did a phenomenal job, just nailed it. Because the conversation when he says, it was not that their flesh had been torn, it was that their souls had been torn out. Mm-hmm. To look in your eyes and see no spark, no love of life, that would break my heart. I mean, I really think that could have been a very realistic conversation between my father and my grandfather.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so here is Dr. Edward Sledge with my Uncle Edward, and then my dad.
A great visual to start us off.
My grandfather was someone that my father had the utmost admiration for.
And I really like the bronze shoes. Can we show those?
So these are a pair of my father's baby shoes that my grandmother had bronzed.
That is so neat. And it's such an important element to think that these iconic characters, these individuals who become synonymous with history, these events, the war in the Pacific, they were babies and toddlers just like the rest of us. They came from upbringings just like the rest of us. And to see his bronze baby shoes, I think is such an endearing and something that's so human that we can relate to.
Well, and as I've re-engaged over the last couple of years with the World War II community, and I see what an iconic figure, and I say this as humbly as I can, when I see what an iconic figure Sledgehammer is and the place he holds in American culture when it comes to military history, it's humbling. You know, it's really humbling, but it's heartwarming at the same time, and it makes me feel good that I can, you know, show little glimpses into the Sledge family for people who are interested.
Well, we're really glad to have you aboard for this journey here on Real History.
Glad to be here.
All right. All that being said, we thank you for tuning in to this first of 10 episodes that will be taking a look at the Pacific. Henry, we'll see you for episode 2.
Looking forward to it.
Until then, stay curious, and we'll see you next time on Real History.